Hi, my name is Angela Green. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois in the Department of Agricultural and Biological Engineering. Today we're going to talk about animal welfare, and we're going to cover some of the vernacular around animal welfare, and we're going to talk about how it applies in specific animal housing, and we're going to start with an example with laying hens. So I'd like to start by asking a question about how you feel about animals. So you have some choices here. Take a look. After you've made your selection, think for a moment. I ask this because everyone comes into this conversation with some background and some perspective about animals. You already have some opinions formulated. You already have some experience that you bring to the table. What we're going to do is add to what you already know about animals and talk about the science of animal welfare. So let's start by defining what is animal welfare. First, let's start with the definition of welfare. Webster's dictionary offers a definition as the state of doing well, especially in respect to good fortune, happiness, well-being, or prosperity. This is a very human-centric definition, but we can take it and expand it with the word animal in front of it. One definition that's been offered by Don Broom in 1996 says an animal's state as it attempts to cope with its environment. I like this definition because it's succinct, it's easy to remember, and it encompasses the two most important pieces of animal welfare. One, it's the animal's state, and two, it's related to its environment, so how it responds as it is coping with environmental challenges. To be clear, animal welfare does not imply animal rights, and that's not what we're going to be talking about in this discussion today. But we do have to discuss animal rights and its relationship with animal welfare in order to complete this definition and this comparison. So when we're talking about animal welfare, we're talking about the avoidance of unnecessary animal suffering. And people who are discussing animal welfare are not opposed to using animals for human purposes, but they are opposed to treating animals poorly, and they're interested in a good quality of life and a humane death for those animals. In opposition to that, animal rights is a philosophical belief, and it is founded around the idea that animals have rights and should never be used for human purposes. So as we discuss animal welfare, we're going to talk about how we consider the parameters or the aspects of interest regarding welfare. So aspects of the environment should be assessed individually. We typically reference them in relative terms, such as better or worse, instead of as good or bad. And sometimes you will hear people use the terms good and bad, but it's more appropriate to say better or worse. It's very difficult to assess welfare overall as good or bad, just as it's difficult to assess individual components as good or bad. Animal welfare can be dynamic in that it can change over time, so welfare status can improve or decline based on situations. And it can vary from animal to animal in the same scenario, based on factors such as social hierarchy, level of fitness, and the experiences of the individual. So in summary, animal welfare is a state of being. Higher welfare refers to a state of animal well-being, and many times you hear well-being and welfare used synonymously, but the difference is just that well-being would be a higher state of welfare. So the things we're looking at when we're assessing animal welfare are in terms of quality of life. And we can look at the physical state of the animal, which would encompass health and fitness and biological function. We can look at the mental state or the affective state of the animal, which would include the animal's perceptions and also the animal's feelings as it sees its surroundings. I say it in quotes because we don't want to be anthropomorphic and assign feelings to animals, human feelings to animals, but animals can certainly have a response or a way that they see their environment. We also look at the animal's ability to perform normal behaviors, and I prefer to say desirable behaviors, because how do we define normal in a captive setting? It's much more appropriate to, say, desirable behaviors. So behaviors that don't cause a detriment to the animal or the animal's handlers. The weighting of these three categories and your willingness to compromise on those and on what's important about those depends on your values. And we'll talk about this as we apply it to an example in just a short while. Another way to look at animal welfare was proposed by Fraser in 2008, and his proposal was to look at the interaction between the affective state, so again, that's the mental state of the animal, the biological function, which is based on the physical state, and what he calls natural living. And when he says natural living, he isn't referring to being outdoors in a natural setting, but he is referring to allowing the animal to perform things that it would perform and that are important to it. So it falls under the same category as behavior, but it's a little different interpretation of the importance of desirable behaviors or of normal behaviors. So let's look at the example with laying hens and talk a little bit about the welfare of laying hens in different housing systems. So currently in the U.S., laying hens, and throughout the world, laying hens could be housed in a variety of different scenarios. Most of our laying hens are housed in what we call a traditional cage. In a traditional cage system, hens are housed in small groups, could range between 4 and 10 to 15 hens. There is a wire mesh floor beneath the hens, and manure is allowed to drop either onto belts or into a collection area beneath the house itself. The cages contain a drinker somewhere in this area that each of the hens would have access to, a feeder, and you can see here one of the hens is feeding. The food and water is supplied automatically in an automated system to the hens. Eggs are allowed to roll out onto a belt, and they're carried to one end of the house for collection. Houses are environmentally controlled with forced ventilation. Lighting is controlled, and as I said earlier, manure is removed from the cages. An enriched cage system is similar to a traditional cage, but has the addition of furnishings or enrichment devices. This might also be called furnished cages or colony cages. There are a number of names out there. But essentially the difference between an enriched cage and a traditional cage is that there's an area for scratching and pecking. Sometimes that's called a dust box, and sometimes it's achieved with a mat, and some of the feed from the automated feeder is thrown out onto that mat as the feeding system runs. It also includes an area for perching, and you can see here there are some bars for perching, and also an enclosure for laying eggs, which could be called a nest box. It's not a nest box in your traditional sense where you think of straw and hens building a nest, but it is an enclosure. And then we move to a cage-free system called a perchery or an aviary. This might also be called a barn system. And as you can see, there are no cages, but there are still multiple tiers. And within this housing system, there are different areas for the hens to perform different tasks or different behaviors. We'll start at the right-hand side. These are nest boxes. They're essentially an enclosure. And in many barn houses now, we see group nest boxes. So you could have a nest box that holds one hen at a time. Or in this case, you can see a group of hens could go in. It's a dark space. It has a sloped floor with a belt for collecting the eggs that would be inside and carrying the eggs to one end of the house for collection. As we move down, this is a littered floor. It's an area for scratching and pecking and dust bathing. There's an area for perching. And then along here, you can't see, but there would be, again, automated feed and automated drinkers, and then areas for perching in there. The barns can be environmentally controlled, just as the cage houses. Lighting can be controlled, but the hens have the opportunity to move from level to level and space to space. And then the last system I want to introduce is a free-range system. And from the picture, you can see the hens are allowed to go outside. But this is somewhat misleading because the hens aren't necessarily allowed to be outside all the time. In most free-range systems, the hens spend the majority of their time indoors in a system on a smaller scale to this barn system. So the hens would be inside, typically on some kind of a littered floor. There probably wouldn't be multiple tiers with activities. All the activities would be on a single level. There would be a nest box, an area for them to lay their eggs. There would be possibly automated and not necessarily automated feeding and drinking. Areas for perching are typically provided, and the group sizes could be around a few hundred to a few thousand hens. If you look at a barn system, the numbers of birds could be in the hundreds of thousands, and for the enriched cages and the traditional cages, again, you could increase that a little bit further into the hundreds of thousands. So I'd like you to take a moment and just reflect on what we've discussed so far and think to yourself about what is a more welfare-friendly system. So choice A is a traditional cage system, choice B is a cage-free barn system, and choice C would be a free-range system. Now let's look at those three choices and talk a little bit about what affects welfare. So the environment within the system has a strong impact on welfare. Specifically, we look at control of the environment, including temperature, relative humidity, air contaminants, which can be generated from manure in the house and from dust, so ammonia, carbon dioxide, and dust, lighting in the house, and housing arrangement. By that I mean, how are the hens separated into groups? How are they interacting with features of the house? So what kind of arrangement do we have? Space is important, both quality and quantity. Acclimation to the environment is very important in terms of welfare. So when introduced to a new system, welfare can drop briefly in order to, as it's a challenge to the hens. And then after they've had time to get used to the new scenario, the welfare can improve and even can return and even improve. Nutrition is important, both quality and quantity. Water is important, both quality and quantity. Sanitation, so the ability to keep the house clean, is very important. Social interactions, so are the animals in isolation or are the animals subject to aggression from other animals? And genetics can play a large role in welfare as well. So research related to animal welfare is centered around the idea of determining what an animal needs and then determining how to best provide it. So let's revisit the scenario that you were given. And as you can see, I've changed the pictures out now, and we still have the same scenarios. We have a traditional cage, we have a cage-free barn, and we have a free-range system. But now I may have skewed your opinion a little bit by showing you some of the potential problems. And let's go through and discuss the things that you might have considered both benefits and potential problems. So within the traditional cage house, you might have considered that cages result in restricted movement, which can be a negative. They also prevent some behaviors that might be desirable behaviors to the hen, such as scratching, dust bathing, and nesting, but it also might prevent some negative behaviors, such as limited ability to fight. Feather pecking can be evident in a traditional cage system and can be variable. Traditional cage systems typically have a low cannibalism incident despite feather pecking being evident. Traditional cages allow for more individual observation and handling, so if you have a sick animal, you have a better chance of seeing it and being able to address that sickness. Traditional cages allow for smaller group size for feeding and potentially less competition at the feeder. The wire mesh floor allows the removal of feces so the animals aren't in contact with their feces. And an additional benefit that's unrelated to welfare is that eggs have minimal contact with feces as well because of the arrangement. The barn is environmentally controlled, and so more often than not, we can provide thermoneutral conditions, which are desirable temperatures, as well as low manure gas concentrations. Now, if we look at the cage-free barn scenario, you might have thought no cages equals less restricted movement, which is a bonus. And it allows the option to perform most of the behaviors that are desirable to hens, such as scratching, dust bathing, and nesting, but it also allows more fighting, so more access to more birds and more space for fighting. Within cage-free barns, we typically see a less stable social hierarchy. So we do see additional pecking and fighting in terms of establishing social hierarchy, and that does lead to a higher cannibalism incidence. Within a cage-free barn, individual observation and handling can be extremely difficult. So if you need to identify an animal that is sick, you may be able to identify it, but finding that animal and catching that animal for treatment can be very, very difficult. Because the animals are in very, very large groups, the competition for feeding can be much higher. So typically a feeder is located with access, or with hens accessing it, in the hundreds. And if you have a hen that is very protective, a very dominant hen who is protective of the feed, that hen can make it difficult for a hen that is lower in the social hierarchy to access the feed. The littered floor allows contact with feces, and some hens don't lay their eggs in the nest box, which allows eggs to also come into contact with feces. The barns are still environmentally controlled, but environmental control can be a little more difficult. And so while we still get mostly thermoneutral conditions, we have more periods where we're outside the desirable range, and we typically see higher manure gas concentrations, specifically in colder weather when we're trying to keep the barns warm, so we ventilate at a lower rate. With respect to a free-range system, you may have considered that the large open spaces allow freedom of movement and seen that as a benefit. The cage-free/free-range system allows the option for most behaviors. We still see feather pecking. It's more variable in this system because of the time outdoors. The space is large enough that hens who are being challenged have the ability to escape. So we still see a higher cannibalism incidence, but it's more variable within a free-range system. There are a lot of variables, a lot of variability from management style to management style within free range. So it has the potential to have higher pecking and higher cannibalism, though we don't see that uniformly across the board. Within a free range system, we have the same challenge that we have in a barn system in terms of individual observation and handling, and it can be very difficult. We still see the high competition for feeding because the hens are in larger groups. And in terms of the time when the hens are outdoors, you don't have as much control over what type of feed they're consuming, as well as the water supply. Because the barn system and the barn system is the basis for a free-range system, there still is a littered floor and ground space. The eggs still have the ability to come in contact with feces, so we have the same challenges there. We have the potential for an environmentally controlled barn, but the time when they're outdoors, we have no environmental control. And as you can see in the picture, this is a wintertime condition with a high wind chill possible. So that's important to consider. In terms of being outdoors, the hens might have contact with wild birds or other wild animals, and we have questions about how this impacts the spread of disease and the potential for spread of diseases. They also have the potential to come into contact with predators, and varying attempts to prevent that show some success, but it still is an option that you don't have with the barn and traditional cage systems. So your decisions regarding what you chose as the most welfare-friendly system would have reflected the personal values and experiences you already had, social influences that may have formulated your thoughts about benefits and drawbacks of each system. You may or may not have included science based on whether you were aware of it, and weighing that against the social influences and your own prior experiences may or may not have allowed you to fully consider science. And you may have factored in other non-welfare concerns. As you noticed when we went through the list, I brought about things like food safety. You may also have considered environmental impacts or economic impacts. And while they aren't welfare concerns, they can certainly skew our opinion about which systems we find favorable, more favorable or less favorable. So again, think about which system you think is more welfare friendly. So one word of caution in terms of thinking about welfare. Always weighing one criteria higher than another may result in compromised welfare in another criteria. So for example, if you consider performing natural behaviors, so the things that a hen would do outdoors, as one of the most important factors, you may prefer a system that allows hens to be more susceptible to a disease or may make it more difficult for handling that animal and can result in the potential for lower welfare in one of those other areas. So instead, it's really important to look at housing as a system where we have interconnected components that work together and influence one another so that we can optimize the welfare in an overall consideration for the hens or for the animal we're talking about. So how do we assess welfare? We're going to save this topic for another day, and from there we're just going to end our discussion about how we talk about and how we discuss animal welfare. So thank you for your time and attention today as we had a conversation about animal welfare. If you're further interested in the topic of animal welfare and environmental systems, you can visit our webpage. It's awesome.illinois.edu, and we have an overview of research, some additional links to education, information about our publications, who works in our laboratory, and a little more about what we do. I appreciate your time, and join us again in the future.